Good morning, everybody. I'm particularly pleased to be invited to Amsterdam, which is actually, if you look at the map, the city of semicircular canals, because they're all nicely arranged around the city center. What I'm going to present today is not a new test, it's a new addition to the head impulse test, and it's called SHIMPs. Before I get started, my disclosures. All the authors here are working as unpaid consultants for GN Autometrics, but these data have all been recorded with our old original non-commercial prototype. So let me first remind you of the traditional head impulse sign once more. If you do this test in this patient with a left vestibular neuritis, you see immediately that he's got a left semicircular canal loss. Why is that? Because the catch-up saccade is a sign of peripheral vestibular loss, as you can see here in slow motion. It's already over now. So these saccades that you can see here, these overt saccades, are a sign of vestibular loss. Now let's look at the paradigm for getting this result. If you do the traditional head impulse test, the target here is fixed while the head of the patient is rotated. And in a normal subject, the eye movement is perfectly compensating for the head movement so that there's no saccade necessary. Now we've added a tiny little but important twist to that paradigm, which is we attached the target here to the head with a little laser, and we're now moving the laser target along with the head movement like this. Can you crank up the sound, please? And what you see here is in a normal subject, all of a sudden, there's a saccade appearing. The saccade is going to the opposite direction. It's an anti-compensatory saccade. It's going to the opposite direction of the head velocity, or of the eye velocity, I have to say, to catch up the target. Now, the data I'm going to show you has been recorded with this non-commercial prototype that actually Hamish McDougall, my colleague and collaborator, is wearing. We've tested all this. Can we go back? We've tested all this in 6 normal subjects and tested 5 patients with complete unilateral loss and 5 patients with bilateral loss. All the animations that you see during this talk have been generated with an iPad and a custom application developed in Objective-C. So, let's again look how such a head impulse test, such a SHIMP, is looking like in a normal subject. You see, with every head impulse, as you can see here, after the head impulse, the patient or the normal subject has to make a catch-up saccade to pick up the target. Okay, now let's have a look how this looks like in real life. What you can see here, this is the laser attached to the normal subject. And with every head impulse test, she has to make a catch-up saccade to pick up the target. So this is the SHIMP paradigm. Again in slow motion. First the VOR is compensating, and then she's got to pick up the target. Again to the other side. First the VOR is compensating, and then the catch-up saccade. For comparison, that's the normal head impulse in this normal person with normal VOR. So what's the difference here? In this new SHIMP paradigm, the catch-up saccade is not a sign of vestibular loss, it's a sign of vestibular function. You need the VOR in order that this saccade becomes necessary. So let's look at some recordings. This again is a perfectly normal subject with a perfectly normal traditional head impulse test, as you can see here. If you test the very same person with this SHIMP paradigm, all of a sudden the recording starts to look very different because you can see all those anti-compensatory saccades appearing here. The gains, as you may notice, they're pretty similar, but if you look closer, they're a tiny bit lower in the SHIMP paradigm than the normal head impulse paradigm. If you now analyze this catch-up saccade pattern in multiple subjects, and we've tested 6 for this graph, you can see the following summary. Here, these histograms are cumulative catch-up saccades, the SHIMP saccades pointing down and the HIMP saccades pointing up. And what you can appreciate here, that as a function of time, normal subject, as you know it from your clinical experience, barely generate any saccades. But as soon as you start doing the SHIMP paradigm, you see lots of catch-up saccades appearing at the latency of about 200 milliseconds. So this is a very robust finding. Now, there's something going on here. Okay. Now, let's look at the other end of the spectrum here in a patient with total bilateral loss. If you do the SHIMP paradigm in this patient, the eyes are simply moving with the head in the SHIMP paradigm, and no saccades are necessary to follow that moving target. Let's look at this in real life. Again, the SHIMP paradigm with a little laser at the headband. And along with the head impulse, the eyes are just following the target with barely any catch-up saccades. On the right, the loss is complete. So the eyes are just following the head impulse. But on his left side, he's got a little bit of function left. So if you look closely, he's got to make a catch-up saccade. So in the SHIMP paradigm, the catch-up saccade is actually indicating residual vestibular function. Here, that's the same patient with the traditional head impulse test. And here you can see the traditional sign of bilateral vestibular loss with catch-up saccades to either side. Here again in slow motion, clock, clock. And to the other side. So what you can see here is, again, the head impulse test, the regular head impulse test. The catch-up saccade is a sign of vestibular loss, whereas the SHIMP saccade is a sign of residual function. Let's look at the traces of this bilateral patient. Here, as you know it from your clinical experience, bilateral overt catch-up saccades indicating a bilateral vestibular loss. But if you reverse the paradigm and apply SHIMPs to these patients, most of these saccades disappear, and there's only a few SHIMP saccades, pointing downwards. Thank you. Okay, again, in a bilateral patient as well, the saccadic pattern completely reverses if you switch from the traditional HIMP paradigm to the SHIMP paradigm. If you look at these patients as a group, and here I have to point out, most bilateral patients are not complete, and therefore the pattern is a bit mixed. So, as you know it from your clinical experience, most of them are throwing in catch-up saccades with traditional head impulse paradigm, but some of them have residual vestibular loss so that they also make a few SHIMP saccades, because most of these patients are not complete bilaterals. So let me summarize what we've learned so far. First, turn back to the gain for a moment, because it's usually an important clinical indicator. So if you do the SHIMP paradigm instead of the HIMP paradigm, you get very similar gain measures, but on average, they're a tiny little bit lower. On average, it's 0.06 that they're lower, although they correlate very nicely. And what's the reason for this? It's VOR suppression. It's only very little VOR suppression, because VOR suppression needs about 80 to 100 milliseconds to occur, but it's enough that it becomes statistically significant. So be aware of that. But the main message in here is that the traditional head impulse catch-up saccade is an indicator of vestibular loss. This is in contrast to the SHIMP saccade, which is actually an indicator of vestibular function, in particular in bilaterals of residual vestibular function. So that's the big difference here. Now, to sum this up, what's going on in unilateral patient if you do SHIMP saccades? For this, look at this patient with a left vestibular loss. That's the traditional HIMP paradigm. Here he's throwing in a covert saccade on the affected side. Whereas there's barely any saccade on the healthy side. Now, if you do SHIMPs on this patient, again the pattern reverses. Barely any saccade on his affected side, but a big SHIMP saccade on his healthy side. So with this paradigm, we moved away his catch-up saccade from his affected side to his healthy side. If you look at this in a real measurement, this is the pattern you all know, a unilateral vestibular loss with lots of covert catch-up saccades, as you may appreciate here. If you take the same patient and do SHIMPs on him, the saccadic pattern completely reverses. Now all the saccades are appearing on the healthy side, whereas there's only a few saccades that are coming later on the affected side. And what's most notable is that you've killed all the covert saccades. So you may appreciate that here, all the covert saccades that you can see here, they're all gone. And leaving you a nice view what's actually going on during the head impulse test, letting you appreciate the gain. So, SHIMP saccades are a very effective covert saccade killer in unilateral patients. If you look at this at the group, on the top you see the measures from the affected side, at the bottom the measures from the healthy side. What you can see here is pointing upward. There's lots of black covert head impulse or HIMP saccades, but barely any SHIMP saccades. And if you then do SHIMPs on them, There's barely any catch-up saccades towards the affected side, and in exchange to that, there's lots of SHIMP saccades appearing on the healthy side. And most importantly, you turn those covert saccades very efficiently into overt SHIMP saccades on the other side. Now, to conclude, I'd like to show you these saccadic pattern once more in a little model. So, assuming a perfect patient or a perfect normal subject with a gain of 1, if you do the traditional head impulse test, there's no saccades at all. If you do the SHIMP paradigm on them, he's doing a huge catch-up saccade or anti-compensatory catch-up saccade going to the other side of about 15 degrees. Now, if you just decrease the gain for a tiny bit, there's a little catch-up saccade appearing in the traditional head impulse paradigm, which is telling you that the patient is missing a little bit of vestibular function. And what I'd like to draw your attention to is that this saccade is actually very small. It's only about 1.5 degrees, whereas the big saccade on the other side is about 15 degrees of side. And in the velocity domain, and that's what you're looking at if you're doing video head impulses, these saccades are overestimated by the naked eye, which means that a little catch-up saccade appearing is a very sensitive sign for vestibular loss. So, with the traditional head impulse test, you're very sensitive in picking up small deficits based on the saccadic pattern. But if you decrease the gain further, here it's 50-50, and reduce it even more until there's only a tiny bit of VOR gain left, you see a little SHIMP saccade appearing, which is telling you that SHIMP saccades are a very sensitive marker for residual vestibular function. So if there's no function left, there's no need to do a SHIMP saccade. But if there's a little bit of function left, these SHIMP saccades are appearing as an indicator of residual vestibular function. With this, I'd like to conclude my talk. I hope I could show you that both the traditional head impulse paradigm and the SHIMP paradigm result in similar gain values, although the SHIMP gains are a tiny little bit lower due to VOR suppression. I hope I could convince you that the SHIMP paradigm is actually reversing the saccadic pattern completely. And while the traditional head impulse saccades indicate vestibular loss, these anti-compensatory SHIMP saccades actually indicate vestibular function, and in particular residual vestibular function in bilateral patients. If you do SHIMPs in unilateral patients, you can very effectively kill those covert saccades and transfer them to the healthy side. And for this reason, we're proposing SHIMPs as an additional paradigm, especially in bilateral patients, for demonstrating residual function, and in unilateral patients for killing those covert saccades. Now, if you think that's all crazy, look at this gentleman. He can even do more fancy saccades. Okay. Now, if we've got time, I'd like to show you an actual SHIMP recording. If somebody can come up to the podium. Because doing the SHIMP recording is actually very simple. The only thing you have to change is you have to switch on this laser light. Yeah, to put it, or so with this, but I don't see don't see what I'm doing. So maybe we do it like this. So okay, have a seat. Great. Where are the goggles? Goggles are here. I'll first do some normal HIMPs. Can you put them on, please, for me? Okay, now move over a bit. Okay, first step is always to calibrate. Open your eyes wide. I'm not in the head impulse yet. Okay, now let's do a quick calibration. So obviously this is not a perfect target, but I have to see what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Oh, it's all right. It's all right. Okay, I accept. Now let's do a couple of regular head impulses. Look at the target here at the back. And look at her beautiful VOR. I'm not in perfect position here. Open your eyes wide. Okay, I think that's enough as a reference. So these are just regular head impulses as you know them from your daily experience. Okay, I don't want to save the video. Okay, I think that's enough as a reference. And now I'm switching to SHIMPs. Now switching to SHIMPs, we don't need to recalibrate. We've already done calibration. Or maybe I do. Okay, and we're already ready to go. Because the only thing I'm actually changing is I'm not switching off the fixation light. Now, I don't have I need to turn a little bit more, but it becomes even more difficult to see what I'm doing. Okay, anyway. Oh, it's on the screen here. Oh, perfect. Okay, now, the main difference is in instruction. So now you tell your patient, just look at the red dot. And it's very intuitive, very easy. So I'm doing a couple of SHIMPs. And you can see all those SHIMP saccades appearing. Very easy. And actually, the other thing that's different doing this paradigm is the way the system is handling the data. Because with the traditional algorithm, if you don't switch to SHIMPs, the system would remove all those impulses because it would think they're bad impulses with saccades going to the other side. So switching to SHIMPs makes the algorithm tolerant to those saccades and keeps those recordings instead of throwing them away. But for you as an operator, if you switch to SHIMPs, it's as straightforward as doing regular HIMPs. Just keep looking. My position is a little bit awkward, so open your eyes wide. One more, and I'm done. Okay. So, as you can see, there's nothing magic about SHIMPs. You just change the instructions, you change the algorithm, and you're getting very nice and clean SHIMPs recordings. Okay, thanks a lot.